All right, folks, so this will be our final class for this semester. Today we're going to talk about psychological assessment. And then at the end of this video, I'll give you a little bit of information about the final, which is already posted on Blackboard. So you can go ahead and look at it, but I'll just give you some tips just in terms of what I'm looking for and how to obviously maximize getting the best grade that you can. But first, let's just go ahead and jump into this idea of psychological assessment. Now, assessment is just the word that we use in psychology for testing. It just usually means we're giving the client or the patient some type of test, usually in order to help us with diagnostics, to help us understand the client better, or to maybe also help the client understand themselves better. There's a type of assessment that was really popular at Texas when I was going to school there, that was called a therapeutic assessment. And what this was just the typical assessment like we'll talk about, but the feedback was done in such a way that the client was really involved in the feedback. Now, typically with these sorts of assessments, you usually write a report, and sometimes that report is not for the client at all. You usually write that type of report anyway. Sometimes you'll give the client maybe something short, like, we found this or we didn't find that, very similar to what you might get from a doctor's office in terms of testing results. But a therapeutic assessment is one where you write the report in such a way that it's to be read by the client, and when you give them that report, you read it together and you go through it and you say, does this make sense to you? Does this match your experience? Does this reveal anything to you about the stuff that we've been working on? This is what I'm thinking about for a diagnosis. This is what that diagnosis means. How does that, how does that make you feel? Right? These types of things. So you work that assessment process into the therapy rather than having it just be a part of it, right? This other thing that you do, and maybe you as a therapist get the results back and you use them for the client, but you don't share with the client that process. Obviously, some therapists, some psychiatrists even doing these types of things don't necessarily want to hand over power in that way. And that's totally fine, right? It is, some people's style to really be the expert in the room. And in fact, some clients really want that, if I'm being honest. Some clients really want to come into the room and have it feel like this guy, this woman knows what she's talking about, rather than, I don't know, how does that make you feel? How does this fit with your experience, right? Some people kind of take a step back at that and say, I don't know, why are you asking me? So, neither one of them is right, is all I'm saying here about in this rant, is that neither one of them are right, but there are two different styles in terms of delivering even the results that you get back from these tests. And again, sometimes in those therapeutic assessments, you might do a little bit of that work ahead of time. So this is what it's going to be like, and let's talk about what it's going to be like if your results are this versus this. And again, other times it's next week when you come in, I want you to take this test before we meet. So it's just two different styles. Before we get started, but what we're really going to talk about in this lecture are these three different styles, these three different types of assessments that primarily get used. These type of assessments that are primarily being used by psychologists to do assessments in their work. So we've got a cognitive assessment, and we've got personality assessment, and we've got projective assessments, and they're all doing different things, obviously, and some of them not quite what you think. So let's go ahead and jump right in first and talk about what cognitive assessments are. So the cognitive assessment is one in which you're really trying to get a sense of how this person is functioning cognitively. Usually, this is going to look like some type of educational test in many cases, obviously IQ test would fall into this category, but really just trying to get a sense of how good is this person at doing this thing? How much has this person learned in this particular area? Or what are the person's capabilities broadly in life or with regard to this one field or this one area? So there are three main types of cognitive testing. Those three types are aptitude tests, achievement test, and then intelligence test. So an achievement test is maybe the test that folks are most familiar with, just outside of a psychological field. That is to say, an achievement test is the type of test that you're often going to take when you're trying to get into college, or the type of test you're going to take often in high school and sometimes in grade school as well, right? These kind of end of the year state tests tend to be achievement tests. Those type of tests that will tell a student, hey, your kid in the 4th grade is reading at a 5th grade level, or your kid in the 6th grade is doing math at a 3rd grade level, right? And so this is an achievement test. And achievement tests are really interested in finding out if somebody has learned knowledge, if they've acquired the type of knowledge that they are supposed to have acquired. So this is the type of test that's really looking backwards. It's really saying, hey, did you learn the stuff that you were supposed to learn in this lesson or in this grade or throughout high school or whatnot? Also, just any type of test that you're going to take in a class. So tests that you're taking from me, tests that you've taken in other classes, those are also achievement tests, right? It's a type of cognitive test to see if you got the knowledge that you're supposed to get from a particular section again or chapter. So again, achievement tests are pretty easy to understand. Some examples of achievement tests that might be up at a higher level are going to be things like a bar exam. So achievement tests can also be used to help see if somebody's ready to go on to a professional practice, to be licensed in a particular area. If some of you are going to be counselors, right, you'll probably have to take some type of counseling licensure or a psychology licensure. Last summer, I took the EPPP, the examination for the professional practice of psychology. That's the psychologist licensure exam. And so all of these, again, are basically achievement tests, although you might also categorize them in the second category, which is to call them an aptitude test. Now, again, an achievement test is looking backwards. It's saying, did you pick this knowledge up that we tried to teach you or this particular field? Whereas an aptitude test is trying to see if you have the potential to do a certain job or to be good in a certain field or a certain career area. And so these tests are often given, aptitude tests are often given, say, as a part of a job application. And in some cases, they may be given if you go to a career counselor, or you're in high school or you're in college and you're trying to figure out, hey, what's my skill set? What am I good at? What would be an area that I would be successful in? If you go to a career counselor and you ask that and they give you some type of test to figure that out, strength finders or something like that, that's an aptitude test. So those types of tests are being used to see, are you going to be good at something in the future? What's your potential in a particular area or in broad areas where we're trying to find what are the things that you're good at, what are the things that you're not so good at. So achievement tests and aptitude tests, these often can get confused because they are somewhat similar. And again, there are some of these tests, right, these licensure exams, these type of things that are a bit of both. They are both testing, did you pick up all of this knowledge? And we're trying to see, are you going to be a good therapist by demonstrating that you've picked up this knowledge? So a little lesson in there, these types of tests aren't necessarily cut and dry as they might seem. So aptitude test, achievement test, or achievement test, aptitude test. And then the third type of test is probably the one that people are most familiar with within a psychological context, and that's an intelligence test. Now, achievement test and aptitude test are usually testing knowledge areas, content areas, skill areas, things that you've either picked up or maybe are just naturally skilled at. Whereas an intelligence test is really trying to see what's your ability. It's almost like a meta question. What's your ability to gain knowledge? What's your ability? What's your broad ability to problem solve or to understand novel situations? And so intelligence isn't ever about a specific area. A true intelligence test is going to try to present you with things that you couldn't have learned, or puzzles that don't make real sense, but can you figure out this conceptual framework in order to figure out the rest of this puzzle or this test. There's a good example of this going on right now online, where you'll see like, banana plus screwdriver equals 5, screwdriver plus banana minus, sunburst, this type of thing where you're supposed to figure out the code, and then at the end, what does it all add up to type of thing. That's a pretty good example of what might be on an intelligence test, right? Because you don't need to know much, right? In a perfect intelligence test, you wouldn't have to know anything, but it's almost impossible to do that. So you don't really have to know much, right? You need to know how to add, you need to know what numbers are, and then you have to just figure out the rest, right? These pictures are supposed to be numbers, and so if these numbers equal these numbers, then, right, you're kind of just logicking your way through that, and that's what a true intelligence test is trying to find out. Intelligence tests will also test things like memory or recall, short-term memory in particular is what I mean, because that is a component of being able to problem solve in a situation, right? How many things can I hold in my head so that I can get through this problem? So again, intelligence is really just a measure of what is your ability to solve, to understand novel situations, where the aptitude and the achievement tests are going to be specific, usually to types of content areas. The achievement test really close to that, and the aptitude somewhere in the middle. But even those wide open aptitude tests are going to funnel you into areas and say you are good at this particular skill. You're good at engineering. You're going to be good at writing. You're going to be good at fashion or something, right? So they're going to funnel you into specific things. Again, where intelligence is just going to say broadly, you're intelligent and you have good verbal capacity and you have good things. That doesn't tell you necessarily what job or jobs you'd be good at. Okay, so some of the reasons that you might give these tests, of course, are those educational reasons that I'm talking about. So just testing in school or trying to figure out if somebody's going to be good for a job. So those vocational uses as well. But why would a psychologist use these tests? Generally, if a psychologist is using any or all of these tests, what they're testing for are intellectual and learning or developmental disabilities. So we're going to give this test to somebody whose parent brings them in and says, I don't know, my kid's really bright, but they're not doing so hot in school, they keep failing. And so one of the things we might do is give a battery of, say, an achievement test and an IQ test, where we give an achievement test, and that achievement test would let us know, hey, Billy's in 7th grade, and so we can see that actually you're right, he's not performing at a 7th grade level on any measure. He's 5th grade at highest, 2nd grade in some areas. But when we give him an intelligence test, he's got an average intelligence. And in fact, he's a little above average in terms of intelligence. So what's going on there? And that is just going to be a piece of the puzzle in terms of leading us into trying to understand or diagnose some problem or some disorder that this kid might have. So that might let us know, for instance, that he's got some learning disability, right? He can solve all of these puzzles that are just pictures, and the IQ test, usually they're going to be face-to-face administered, one person to another, so there's not really much reading. It's being read to you. The types of things that you have to interact with or figure out are usually pictures or just shapes. And so that's going to give us a lot of information, right? We're not just looking at the results of the test in order to understand what's going on for particular clients. We're also able to look at how are they taking the test? What parts are giving them trouble? Do they just not have patience? Maybe this is an ADHD situation, and it's just hard for him to pay attention in class. Because when we were doing the intelligence test, which takes 3 hours of face-to-face interaction, he wanted to get up every 2 minutes, and he just had a really hard time sitting there and finishing the test, right? All of those things are things that we're going to build into that report, whether we share that therapeutically or not. But those are the things that we're going to be paying attention to in addition to just the results that they're providing. So cognitive tests, again, mostly I would say you're going to see these in educational arenas, but clinicians do use them, and they use them relatively often. And when they are using them, again, they're usually going to be looking for one of these pieces, either some intellectual learning or developmental disorder that might be, making it difficult for the kid or adult to learn in a certain situation. Okay, so next we're going to look at personality assessments. Okay, so the term personality assessments might be a bit of a misnomer in terms of what these types of assessments, what these types of tests are actually used for, they're actually doing. So these types of tests aren't personality tests in the sense of looking for personality type or personality traits, something like the Neopie, the Big Five, or the Myers-Briggs. Those are personality tests, and those tests do get some clinical use, to be fair, but usually not in a diagnostic sense, usually more in a counseling sense versus a clinical sense, if you get that distinction. Where a clinical sense is usually more about treating some disorder, where a counseling sense, this is just traditionally, of course, the counselor sense is usually about helping a person gain understanding or see their way through a particular problem in their life. So those personality tests, again, are going to be better used for just helping a person explore a thing, though it might be helpful in terms of how a person's getting depressed or how a person is getting anxious in certain situations at a certain time. But when we talk about what we mean when we talk about personality assessments generally in clinical or counseling psychology or counseling or social work is a type of test that's trying to help us diagnose, conceptualize, or maybe in some ways even treat a particular client or a patient. So types of tests that you might be familiar with that are considered personality tests are going to be things like the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the CCAPS, which is the College Counseling Assessment of Psychological Symptoms. So the MMPI is probably the most well-known of these types of personality tests. And what's going to happen, and I'll put some of this stuff up on the screen here while I'm talking, but what's going to happen is you're going to answer for the MMPI a very, very long list of questions. Let's see here. The MMPI has 567 yes or no questions. So it's a super long list. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a booklet of questions that are written in, 10-point font, and maybe there's 5-10 pages, and you're just going through for probably an hour or two, just answering yes, no to all of these questions. And so I've got a list here just of a few examples. Question one, and they really run the gamut, and when we look at the results, you'll see why. So question one is, I like mechanic magazines. Question two, I have a good appetite. Question three, I wake up fresh and rested in the morning. Question 17, my father was a good man. Question 22, at times I have fits of laughing and crying that I cannot control. Question 27, evil spirits possess me at times. So they really run the gamut in terms of what these questions are trying to get at, or what they're trying to understand about the client or patient that you're working with. And what you're going to end up getting is a report like this, where you can see here that there are two lines where the patient is considered within a normal range. And so that line you can see here is between 50 and 70. And so if a client scores between 50 and 70, you can see in this example that many of this particular client's answers did, or their scores did fit within here, then those are considered within a normal range, and the interpretation is just normal. So nothing to talk about. So if they rise above that second line, that's considered an elevation. And that means that there's something diagnostically unique, or there's something that we need to consider with that particular scale. So you can see here that there is also kind of this division between the left and the right half of this report. And on the left half, what you have here are what we call the validity scales of a particular test. So real personality assessments, that is to say clinical personality assessments, often have this type of scale built in. The MMPI is known for having one of the most sophisticated versions of this scale. So you can see here that across the left line, what you have, or across the left half of that report, what you have is the VRIN, the TRIN, F, FB, FP, FBS, L, K, and F. What those things stand for are variable response inconsistencies. So this means that the person is answering questions that should be answered similarly in different ways. So you might get a question that is, I get sad often. And then you might get a question that's kind of the reverse of that question, I'm rarely sad. Well, if you answer both of those yes, right, that's going to be an inconsistent answer. And if you do that a lot of times, what's going to happen is the test is going to pick up on the fact that you're being inconsistent with answers that should be the same, and it's going to elevate the score and say this person is giving answers that are inconsistent with one another. Their within group variability is not very good. Within group validity, is not very good. The next is the TRIN, which stands for True Response Inconsistency. And what this is just looking for is if the person is basically going down and answering all true or all false. So true response inconsistency would just mean it looks like this person's just only saying true. Their responses are inconsistent, but they're not even inconsistent in a predictable way. They're inconsistent in a way that just means that they don't seem to even be looking at the question. They're just saying true all the time. So you've also got, I'm going to skip around a bit, you've also got the L scale. Now this is one of the oldest scales. This was even in the MMPI 1 and in the MMPI 2, which is the one that's most often used. There's also an MMPI A, which is a version for adolescents, people under 18, maybe even under 17, I think. That version is actually the newest version, but the MMPI 2 is the one that's still most often given. And so the lie scale is a scale that's actually trying to see if the client is trying to fake good. That is to say, are they telling us that they're really too good to be true? And the MMPI tests for this by putting in questions that are kind of negative, but that people should still say yes to, still should say that these things happen to me. So sometimes I get so angry I could yell, or sometimes I just don't feel like doing anything, or sometimes I wish I could just steal a bunch of money and get away with it, right? So these types of questions that most people, if they're being relatively reasonable and honest, are going to say, yeah, I guess, that'd be nice, or yeah, I do not feel like doing something all the time. But if a person is always kind of saying the more positive thing, the test is going to pick up on the fact that this person doesn't think anything, or they're at least not willing to admit anything negative about themselves. And so that test is called the lie scale. There's also the F scale, which is the infrequency scale. And this is almost the opposite of the L scale, or the lie scale. The F scale is trying to see if the person is faking bad, if they're trying to say that their life is a lot worse than it is. And you can imagine in a clinical capacity some situations in which that might arise. In addition to people trying to say that they're good all the time, nothing bad ever happens to them, you can also imagine people saying, oh, my life is so terrible, I'm so sick, please help me, please take care of me, please prescribe me whatever it is I want. And so this test, again, is also going to have some questions that are going to pick up on, well, here are some good things that happen to most people. Even when I am having a terrible day, it's nice to get a call from, I don't know, somebody who loves me. or even if even if I'm angry at everyone, I can still manage to enjoy a good meal, right? Just trying to, those are not good examples. I didn't pull those out of the list here, but that's just some ways in which you might see that the test is trying to see, is this person just faking bad? Or are they trying to say that their life is a lot worse than it is? If they can't even say, you know, even if I'm feeling bad, I can still do this, or I can still do that. Type of thing. So there's also a K scale, which is the defensiveness scale. And so this is a person who seems to be in denial, or they seem to be trying to evade questions. To be honest, I'm not sure how they're testing for this in particular, but what they're looking for, again, there are people who are trying to be in denial or trying to be evasive. Practically, I'm not really sure how that's different than faking good, but it's got its own scale. So there it is. There's several here, and I'll put up a list if it's not up already, of just these different, all of these kind of different lie scales, or these different validity scales that are used on the MMPI. Some of them aren't even listed, right? You can see there the cannot say. And so this would probably just be a count of how many times the person says, doesn't answer a question, doesn't give us a true or a false. And if there are too many of those, just that's going to be a true. In most assessments, if there are too many questions that the client doesn't answer, well, then we're not going to be able to score it accurately. So elevations, what's really interesting about this is that elevations on any of these scales, any of these validity scales, should invalidate the whole test. That is to say, when you look at that output, the first thing you do is you look at the left half of the screen and you say, well, do they have any elevations on the validity scales? And if they do, you are supposed to stop there. That's it. You didn't take this test accurately. I can't really interpret the rest of what's going on. And sometimes it's not malicious, right? Sometimes that might be where some of this therapeutic assessment can be helpful. Listen, it's okay. We're not going to cut your services. If this happens, you should feel, this is going to be confidential. You should feel open to tell us anything you need to tell us, this type of thing. And so sometimes you just need to go back and ask them to take it again and reassure them. And then, of course, other times people are, purposefully trying to deceive the test. And sometimes you need to let them know, hey, the test is able to catch if you're going to deceive them or going to try to deceive it. We can't help you if you don't answer this honestly. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. You let them take it again, maybe a third time, and then sometimes you say, I think we're gonna have to try something else. Okay, so that's the MMPI, again, one of the most well-known tests. I'm sorry, I should probably tell you what the actual scales are. So you can see on the right side there, those are the scales that you're actually interpreting in terms of clinical stuff. So the MMPI isn't just a lie detector test. It is a test that's trying to get at some clinical understanding of the client. So what you have over here, one of the things about the MMPI, this list that we have here is not all of the scales. These are the first ones, the kind of most important ones that you interpret, but there are at least 2 or 3 more pages of these scales that you can go through and kind of drill down into what's going on for the client, right? Those 567 questions are going to give us more data than just this one line graph. So you can see there that you've got the HS scale, and that stands for hypochondriasis. That's hypochondria, right? A hypochondriac. So somebody who thinks they've got a lot of bodily symptoms. The D is for depression. The HY is for hysteria. This is an awareness of problems and vulnerability. So this is similar to probably neuroticism in a more kind of personality test. So that sense of just being kind of hyper aware of what's going on to the point of being worried. I think neurotic would be a better word here than hysterical. That's word is a bit problematic. PD, you've got psychopathic deviant. So this is gonna try to measure psychopathy, but the way they're measuring that, as you've heard me talk about, I have a problem with the sort of DSM way of measuring that, and it looks like they're following that here, which is saying that they're looking at conflict, struggle, anger, and then respect for society's rules. MF stands for masculinity and femininity. This is, again, another problematic scale. I think it is looking at masculinity and femininity in sort of a gender role style. So it's really asking, do you like mechanic magazines? Do you like sports? Do you like to get dressed up? Do you like to go to the salon, right? These very kind of stereotypical masculine and feminine behaviors, but that's what that's getting at. The PA is paranoia, as we've talked about, so level of trust, suspiciousness, and sensitivity. PT is psychophenia, which is basically just anxiety. SC is schizophrenia. This is measuring that kind of disordered thinking, that disorganized thinking that we see as kind of emblematic of some schizophrenic. So obviously it's not measuring everything that a schizophrenic could experience, but it is trying to get at that cognitive style, that odd thinking. And then MA is hypomania, so just mania, and then SI is social introversion. So there's some problems here, right? And again, this isn't the exhaustive list of scales, but these are kind of the main scales of the test. It is sort of a wonder to me that this is still used, or at least it hasn't been updated to be more in line with kind of a modern perspective, a modern diagnostic perspective, at least of psychology. We get this kind of weird mix of diagnosing depression and, mania, but then also masculine, feminine, and psychopathic deviant. I guess that's something you test for, but it's not exhaustive, and there's gaps and there's strange things. So I've never found it particularly useful in terms of a test that I would give in a clinical setting, but it is still reportedly one of the most well-used clinical tools. Just briefly, we can look at the CCAPs. It's very, very similar to the MMPI. It's a little more direct and streamlined. There aren't these type of lie scales. There aren't these type of validity scales that you see in the MMPI. And the questions that they're going to ask you are going to be pretty straightforward in terms of trying to help us get a sense of what type of clinical problem, diagnostic features, or symptoms that you're coming in with. And so basically what you're going to get out of a report like this is just to look at their depression, general anxiety, social anxiety, academic distress. Remember, the CCAPS is for college counseling centers, so they're going to have some academic pieces in there where you might not see this in, say you're going to a community counseling center and they gave you this type of test before you came in. You're probably not going to see educational or academic stuff on there. But then also eating concerns, hostility, alcohol use, and then here you have the distress index, which is really just an average of all those prior indexes put together. So it's similar to what you see on the MMPI, where what you're looking for is to see if they have any elevations. The CCAPS has 2 levels of elevation, where the MMPI only had that 1. And so what you can see here is that you can have what's called a moderate elevation, and then if you go all the way up to that dark gray area, that's what we would consider to be a severe elevation. One of the nice things about these type of personality tests, these clinical tests, is that when you're using them in conjunction with clinical treatment, or just somebody who's in for therapy or even psychiatric treatment, you can get a sense of how their symptoms are diminishing over time. Again, there's no tricks here, so if the client isn't interested in being straightforward, this is a test that's really easy to fool. But these types of tests, this test in particular, the CCAPS, is one that you would give, again, somebody who's coming into counseling willingly. And so who's coming into counseling willingly, and so they usually have their own interest in mind. They usually are there to seek help, and so they're not going to be as reluctant to let you know what's going on, as somebody might be if they were mandated to therapy or if they were mandated to some testing, which is why and how you might get some of those elevations on something like the MMPI's lie or faking scales. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the personality testing, where again, it's really more of a clinical testing than it is actually personality testing. You can see with MMPI that they do build in some personality features in there, but really it's more about that clinical stuff, even in the MMPI. There are other tests like the Milan. There's a test called the Milan Multiphasic Inventory, the MMI. This test, for instance, is one that does a little bit more with personality, but it does still also give some diagnostic features as well. The thing you should know about these types of tests is that they are generally, unlike a true personality test or a personality test that we think of as a personality test, these tests aren't going to really give you a good and bad about you. These type of diagnostic tools are really only going to say this person has problems in these areas, this person is distressed in these areas. It's not going to give you any strengths the way that you might expect. If somebody tells you you're taking a personality test, it's going to say, oh, you're good at this, you're good with people, or you're a really logical person. None of that's really going to come out of any of these tests. Even the Milan, again, which is going to give you some more personality features, but they're going to be more like, this is a dejected personality, or this person has a negative outlook, these types of things. Okay, so lastly, let's get into the projective testing. And this is some of my favorite types of tests. If you ask other people on the faculty, they're going to have differences of opinion here. But I find this type of test really useful and surprisingly, I would say, accurate in terms of being a diagnostic tool. So the theory behind projective testing is just that if I give you some ambiguous stimuli, if I give you something that could be anything, obviously the Rorschach, right, is a type of projective test. That's one of the ones that's very well known. We'll talk a bit about it. But if I give you something that's ambiguous, like an ink blot, whatever it is to you, whatever it is that you tell me that you see, that's really about you. That's really about what's going on for you more than it is about what this ambiguous, splash of ink is. And so the idea behind a projective test is that you give folks ambiguous stimuli and you let them interpret it, and you use their interpretation to understand what's going on for them psychologically. Now, again, the Rorschach is one of the most well-known types of projective tests, but there are some others and we'll talk about them, but let's start with taking a look at the Rorschach. So here are the Rorschach plates. There are 10 of them. There are only 10 of them. And so the Rorschach isn't just any ink blot. The Rorschach isn't a bunch of ink blots. The Rorschach are these 10 ink blots that are always given in the same order for every Rorschach test. And so they do go left to right and then top to bottom. So the one in the upper right hand corner that you see there, that is the second one, and then the third one is the one on the second row in the left. And so the way the Rorschach in particular is given is that you're going to sit down again face to face, you're going to present the card to the client, and you're going to say verbatim, what might this be? And that's all you say. If the client asks questions, or what am I supposed to be doing? You point to the card and you say, what might this be? This is a type of test that came about and so very much still has the psychoanalytic, what we call blank slate, that is to say the type of therapist who isn't going to give you much. They don't want to influence your answer. They don't want to influence your therapy by being even happy for you or being sad for that thing that happened, right? It's just going to be, that sounds like this, please continue, right? Or I heard you say this, and then what happened, right? And so that's going to be the same type of style that is recommended, at least when giving the Rorschach, right? You're not giving them much because they are supposed to project on this card. And if you add, more data, if you add more noise into that situation, then they can maybe use some of what you're saying or how you're responding to what they're saying to alter how they're projecting onto the card. So you are supposed to just give that one instruction, what might this be? And then you let them go on, right? And what you do is you're actually going to give 2 passes. You're going to go through all 10 cards. What might this be? What might this be? And you're going to let the client give more than one answer to each card, because in order for the Rorschach to be valid, you need at least 20 responses. They can give more than 20, they can give 100 if they want, but they need at least 20, so that's about 2 per card. What you will see is that sometimes people give 4 on one card and 1 on another card, but you just need 1 on each card, and then you just need 20 total. And so if they don't get to 20, you can start back over and ask them to go through them again, or you can just stop and say, well, that's not going to be enough. We'll have to try this another time, or we'll have to try a different way to get at this information. So that's the first pass. So you go through and you say, what might this be? And you let them tell you whatever it is they see. You don't ask them any questions, except just to clarify what they're calling a thing, right? So it looks like something that flies. Can you say more about that? It looks like a chicken. Okay. So the second pass, what you're going to do is you're going to go back through and you're going to read the answers that they gave to you. So on card 3 here, you said that this looks like a chicken. Can you show me where you see the chicken? And so you let them kind of circle the area or point to whatever area. Maybe it's the whole card, maybe it's a piece of the card, maybe it's several, disjointed pieces of the card. And then you say, okay, show me how you see the chicken. Okay, and then they'll start saying stuff like, well, this looks like the beak, and this part right here, this could be the body, and those look like kind of 2 weird legs or something, right? And so they're going through and they're saying this type of thing, and what makes it look like, and so you're gonna keep following up. What makes it look like a body? Oh, you can see it's like kind of feathers. Oh, it makes it look like feathers. Well, you can see how it's kind of layered, how the ink's kind of layered here, this type of thing. And so you just kind of keep digging in, and what you're really trying to get them to reveal to you is how they're seeing it. And this turns out to be the more important aspect of the Rorschach. A lot of people think that the Rorschach is about what it is I see. If I say I see demons, if I say I see sexual things, then the doctor's gonna think I'm a weirdo. But maybe there is something to what you see, and I'll talk about that. But what we're really looking for is, how do you see it? There is more science to the Rorschach than people give it credit for, because what we're testing for is, it turns out that people who share symptom sets seem to perceive things in similar ways. At least that's what the data show in terms of using the Rorschach. So if you tell me that you see a chicken here because you see the white space looks like feathers, or that red thing looks like a beak, I'm listening for you to say, okay, they're looking at the colors here, they're looking at the white space here. If you say it looks like feathers because of the texture, okay, they're looking at the texture of the ink. And all of those different descriptors, all of those different ways of seeing the image turn out to be codes. And there's a huge Exner coding book. If we're ever back in Warrensburg and you want to come by my office and see it, it's this huge reference book that has all of the codes in it, and it teaches you how to add up these different codes to tell you what certain things might mean. There's probably hundreds of them. I don't remember them all, but some of them, for instance, again, if a person's interpreting a lot of white space, that often means that they have a lot of anger. This tends to be something that angry people do. If they are interpreting a lot of shading, for instance, right, they're interpreting the texture of the ink, so to speak. then that can mean that the person has some anger, but that they tend to mask it, right? That they tend to sort of hold it back and keep it bottled up, and not want to necessarily share it with other people. So it's these type of things that we're looking for. It's not just, oh, you see demons, you're possessed, or you're a what's it called? A nymphomaniac. You keep seeing sex in all of these images. It's not really as simple as that. It really is more about how you're seeing the image. Now, we do use the content, that is to say what it is that you see. That is some information there. And here's another piece I remember is there are a few answers for each card that are what are called the popular answers. That is to say, these are the answers that most people see. So for instance, back on card 1, a popular answer for that card is anything flying. So a bat or a moth or a butterfly or an angel, anything like that is a popular answer for that card. We're also counting popular answers. That's kind of the only content thing that we're looking for that can kind of give you points or take away points, so to speak, in terms of a Rorschach. It's not the end-all be-all, but it is something that we're calculating. And what the popular answer tells us is, you see things the way most people see them. Right? If you have a really high popular score, well, that means that, you tend to see things right down the line, right? You tend to see things as the world sees them. You're not having, weird ideas. You're not maybe reinventing the wheel, right? These type of things. If you don't have any popular answers, that might, on an extreme end, lead to maybe some type of thought disorder, or maybe somebody who just, really thinks really differently, maybe a schizotypical personality or something like that. So, but generally, right, we're looking for, did you give a few? Did you see some of the popular things, or did you see all of them, or did you see none of them? And so this is how the Rorschach is interpreted. I should say about the Rorschach, I usually say this right after I get an example from a student in class. Just one card, so I can't interpret it. But I usually say right after that, never take a Rorschach. Again, the Rorschach is one of these types of tests that is only going to give you negative things about you. The best you can do on the Rorschach is for them to say this person is normal. It's not going to give you any strengths. I say that in particular because it seems like the type of test that could do that, but the way that it tends to be scored, there are various ways to score it, but by and large, the way that it's mostly scored in clinical practice is called the Exner scoring method, and this method only looks for deficiencies, only looks for this person is got poor mental health in this way, this person is too angry in this way, this person is withholding in this way. It's not going to say this person's hopeful or creative or inspirational or anything like that. So I always tell people never take you can take one for class or if you're just curious, but often the Rorschach is given in forensic situations. That is to say, custody battles or trying to get a psychological profile on someone. I've seen it used that way with colleagues and with mentors that I've had, and it's from the clinician side, it's a good way to get some of these things, but from the client side, it's not going to tell you anything good about yourself. So decline the Rorschach if you're ever seeking custody of your kids, God forbid, and they say, well, let's give you a Rorschach to see if you're a good parent. It's not going to help you. Okay, so some of the other tests are that you may have heard of, and I'll just talk about this one at length and then just mention some of the other ones, are the thematic apperception test, often called just the TAT. And this is sort of a step up, I would say, from the Rorschach. One thing that's needed for folks to engage in these projective tests, they do have to be able to play a little bit. They do have to be able to engage with an image and make believe and project on it. And sometimes that's just a matter of imagination. Sometimes that's a matter of intelligence. And sometimes that's a matter of holding back. Like the client just doesn't feel safe kind of make believing with you in that way, right? Imagine, I gave a projective test to some Army veterans when I was working at the VA in Austin, Texas. And, you know, I don't know, man, it's just a picture, you know, like they really didn't kind of feel free enough, I think. I don't think it was an intelligence piece. I think it was just, they just didn't feel free enough to kind of play in that moment, right? I can imagine maybe if their daughter or, you know, their granddaughter would have come up and said, Daddy, you know, what does this look like, right? That they could have jumped into that process, right? But you need people to be a little bit trusting. You need to have some rapport often for them to engage in this process, to kind of play with these pictures, or at least to open up in a way that's going to be helpful. And so this is something that some folks just can't do, certainly with the Rorschach. And so you can step up from the Rorschach and do what I'm describing here, which is the TAT test. And these images are still ambiguous, but as you can see, they are real pictures, they're real descriptions, or they're real depictions, of situations. The situations themselves are what's ambiguous here. And so you ask the client to interpret what's going on in this picture. Who is this woman? Who's this man? How did they end up in this situation? What happened right before this? What's going to happen next? Was it a good idea for them to show up together, right? And so you're just going to kind of ask about the situation and for them to kind of make believe the story before and after, and who are these characters, et cetera, et cetera. And the interpretation here is a lot more literary, I like to think, but also straightforward in some ways, because here you are literally just looking for themes, right? So if I show you 10 cards, and the TAT is different than the Rorschach in that there are a lot of cards. I'm actually not sure how many, probably 50 or so. And then you just choose 10 of those that you want to use with your client. And so you show them these 10 cards, and maybe all of the men in the cards are villains. You know, every time there's a man in the picture, he's trying to hurt a woman, or he's trying to steal from somebody, or, you know, he's trying to figure out a way to do something terrible. That is a literal, right, like a literary interpretation of every time there's a man in the picture, right? This might be how you interpret that with them. Every time there's a man in the picture, it seems like they're a bad guy. Do you experience a lot of bad guys in your life, right? And so this is just kind of a really natural way to have a conversation about maybe some of the themes that are going on within that person's life, or the themes that that person carries with them in terms of how they see the world, how they're interpreting things. And this can illuminate, some of those problems and just open it up for therapy. Again, the fact that you can pick the cards that you want to use in the TAT is really helpful here, because some of the cards are, male-female couples. Some of the cards are all women, some all men, some children, some all boys, some all girls, right? And then a lot of cards that are mixed up. And so you can kind of pick out which themes that you think you need to hit on with your client to see, how are they thinking about men? How are they thinking about children? How are they thinking about relationships? How are they thinking about death, right? These type of things that you can pull themes out of. It's just a way to get them to talk about it. So some of the other tests that I will just briefly mention are the early memories test. And this is just a test where you ask folks to tell you what their earliest memory is. Again, this maybe seems like less of a projection, but nobody really knows what their earliest memory is. But you're probably going to have a memory that's important, that's relatively early, right? And that early memory that you called up as being the first probably just means it's one of the first important memories to you. And so that's going to maybe give us a sense of what's going on, where you are in a particular place in your life, or where you feel like you are in your life broadly. You ask what's your earliest memory, and then you ask what's your second earliest memory after they tell you the first one. And then you say, what's your first memory of your mother? And then what's your first memory of your father? And then what's your first memory of a toy? And that's the whole test, right? Obviously, they're going to tell you paragraphs and paragraphs for these memories, hopefully. And you can ask some follow-up questions. These are really free form, unlike the TAT and certainly the Rorschach, where you've got this kind of prescribed way of interacting. Here, you're just asking for these memories and then following up. This is still, again, a psychoanalytic test, and as all projective tests really are. And so there is still some blank slateness that you can use if you of that kind of persuasion of not wanting to give them much. Oh, that sounds tough. Maybe you don't give them that. Maybe you sound okay. Sounds like you broke your leg when you were 4, and then what happened, type of thing. Another test, and here's one you've probably heard of and maybe not thought of it as a projective test, is a word association. So I say apple, you say orange, I say banana, whatever. And so just that type of thing where you give somebody a word and then you let them follow up with it. There's a couple ways of doing this where maybe you let them kind of keep track of that word. So I say banana, and then you say apple, orange, basketballs or something. And so you can kind of let them keep going, or you might interject, right? You say basketball, I say sports, you say, right? And you can kind of guide the association there, or you can just let them kind of spill or continue to go on, kind of cascade with their own word association, which gets a little closer to this next one, which is called free association. And free association is really the psychoanalytic method. Let's begin. Right? And you don't say anything, right? You let the client kind of go on about, well, what am I supposed to say? And you just stare at them, right? Man, you're just like my dad. He never tells me what I'm supposed to be doing. The therapy's begun, right? And it takes longer than that, but that's the idea, is you kind of let them stew in that silence, you let them stew in the emptiness, and you see what freely shows up, and you interpret that. It sounds like when you don't know what to do, you get befuddled, and that brings up some memories of your father. Let's talk about your childhood, right? Let's talk about that. And so that's just another one of those types of projective tests. Again, it really is the whole psychoanalytic method, is just to let the client free associate, interpret, and then free associate. And then lastly, again, dream interpretation. I think this is also a type of projective test. This time, of course, the dream itself being the projection. You sort of get a double projection here, because the dream itself, the content of the dream, is of course a projection of the client or the patient's mind. But what's also going on is now you have an opportunity to sit back and then try to interpret the projection. So project on the projection. And so you get this way of really delving into what's going on for a client. So what this looks like, there's a lot of different ways to interpret dreams. I prefer, of course, the Jungian method, where you introduce to the client what symbology might be associated with the thing. You do that eventually, I should say. So first you say, I don't know, I dreamed of a woman in a purple dress and she was standing at the edge of a cliff and she threw a torch in the water. I don't know. That was a free association. And so I say, well, what does the color purple mean to you? Why do you think she was dressed in a purple dress there? I don't know. I've always thought that purple had something to do with royalty, but my dad has this cool purple shirt that he always wears, and I find it really. I don't know. I find it really stupid. So, right, I'm going crazy, but the idea here, right, is that you kind of dig into, you let them begin to project and interpret on what's happening, what the content of their dream is, and therein you sort of let them unfold what the meaning of that dream might have been, if you believe that dreams have any sort of meaning. Right, because Jung believed that, of course, while we do have the collective unconscious and some things maybe do hold a collective symbology, really the best person to tell you what a symbol means for their subjective experience is the person whose experience it is. So the color purple for me reminds me of my dad, versus the color purple kind of having this general, meaning of royalty and regality. And so that's how you might use a dream interpretation as a projective test as well. And then maybe that leads into some content. Let's talk about your father again, right? All right, so those are all three of the different types of tests that we tend to give. There are other cognitive personality and projective tests that we haven't talked about, but that's just a broad overview of the ones that I've used personally, and then some of the ones that I see used most often in practice. So now just a little bit about your final. So the final, as if you've had a look at it, is really just you describing a person and then also giving them a diagnosis. Now, the test is written in such a way that you give the diagnosis and then you give the description, but I like to recommend that you actually write the description first and then read your description and then go back and diagnose. Because sometimes what I've seen happen is that folks will give a diagnosis and they will intend to describe a person who has that diagnosis, who has this background, who has these presenting problems, who has these various symptoms, but when they're writing it, they forget, right? They say the person's got anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, and rule out schizophrenia, and then they forget to talk about the bipolar disorder. And that's, that doesn't make for a good test, because what I'm going to do in order to grade it, what I'm really looking for, what I like to say is, does your equation add up? So if you say that this person has this history, this person has these presenting problems, etc., I want to be able to see the evidence of the diagnosis that you're presenting at the top of the page there. So I really want to see that you can describe a real person, right? We've kind of been going through this throughout the semester, where first you're just looking at the disorder and how it might be connected to a community, and then you're looking out in the community to see, can I see signs and symptoms out there? And then what I want you to do is just really synthesize, right? This is kind of the ultimate form of learning, is can you synthesize somebody who is a particular diagnosis in a way that is relatively believable. So again, what I'm looking for is just, does the diagnosis match the description? I'm going to be looking mostly for that part into the presenting problem, into the historical piece. There's also a section there that's for other. You can use that section for any other information that you think is relevant or extra information. Often I'll get in some of my classes, when we get to the final, where would I put this, or where would I put this? I want to describe this about the client. And so that's what that section is for. I do want you to use it. I want you to use it for something. I want you to find something else that's going on with that client, even if that's just an extension of the history section, even if that's just an extension of the presenting problem section. Just don't leave anything blank. So the other parts of that exam aren't going to be you describing the client. That's going to be those main first 2 and 3 sections. And then what you're going to do is you're going to give me a prognosis, and you're going to give me a treatment plan. So the prognosis is what's going to happen. What's the course of this disorder? What's going to happen to somebody who comes in with depression? What's going to happen if they stay for treatment? What's going to happen if they don't stay for treatment? What's going to happen if they take medication, right? So the prognosis is what you can expect given the disorder. It's what you get when you go to the doctor and you say, I've got the flu, and they say, well, you're going to be sick for a couple days. You should probably expect that maybe you're going to throw up, you're going to have a stuffy head, you're going to have a fever. That's going to last for this long, and then slowly you're going to get, but right, that's the prognosis. What's going to happen? And so what I want you to be able to do there is to say, this client's got depression, and they've come in, well, we expect it to last this long. Given this client's particular situation, this might get worse, this might get better over time. And then the last thing that you're going to give is the treatment plan. What do you recommend in lieu of that diagnosis and in lieu of that prognosis? So that might be some combination of either therapy, medication. Don't forget about group therapy. Don't forget about just, out of the box stuff. You can't, as long as it's some type of valid therapy. So art therapy, sanitary therapy, I'm more than willing to hear and to learn what it is that you found can be a good treatment for this. So you're free to think outside of the box in that way. But I do want the plan to make sure that it matches up for the client that you have described in particular. So if you say that you've got a 45-year-old low income heroin addict that you're treating, and you tell me that you want to send them to San Diego, California to a sleepaway 90-day treatment center, I'm going to wonder who's paying for that, right? So what would you actually prescribe for a client who was in this situation? Now, you can make that obviously as easy or difficult for yourself as you want, but if you make a particular client, I just want to see that you're really thinking about the identity piece as well as the diagnostic piece in terms of how you're going to treat them. Okay, that's it, folks. It's been great. I'm really sorry that we didn't get to do this in person. This is one of my favorite classes to teach, to talk about some of these things, especially with graduate students. And we were having a great class. You guys were very interactive, so I do miss that. If you have any questions by the time this gets posted about the final, or if you're still getting those personality disorder papers in, get them in ASAP. I will start grading those very soon, both those papers and then the finals once they come in. We don't have too long before we have to submit grades. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, it's been great. I'll see you around in the fall, I hope.